My previous video brief entitled Luminous UAP over Tokyo was based on the experience shown here in this fast speed video playback, which at the time defied any explanation based on the observed data and my existing knowledge. Hence I call the luminous objects UAP, which is short for Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena. This interesting video was recorded in the early morning hours of October 16. I got a few comments saying they were Starlink satellites. However, for a number of reasons, I felt that could not be true. Because if they were, why could I see them on Monday morning, but nothing similar Tuesday or Thursday during the same week at exactly the same time? It seemed like a unique observation. Well, I was unconvinced, but decided to investigate it myself anyways. And what I learned about Starlink really surprised me, so I hope you will watch the rest of this short video to see how I came to that conclusion, because it might surprise you too. As you probably guessed, this image is a vector map of the objects plotted in the sky. Now, if they were satellites, this means they were all moving away from me, but in a kind of crosshatch pattern. Thinking about this from a viewpoint of these objects being Starlink satellites, belonging together in groups, I deduced that there must be at least 4 groups or maybe even 5 represented in the pattern. I learned that Starlink satellites originally orbit in a single-file train-like pattern, but over time the train begins to naturally disperse. However, a Starlink train group will remain on a unified parallel directional orbit, but they are no longer aligned. So this vector plot could conceivably make sense as 4 or 5 Starlink satellite groups. And certainly there were also 1 or more satellites that may not have been Starlink, like this one lone wolf moving transversely across the horizon. So putting them all together again, it looks kind of like this. But what this implies is that 4 or 5 different Starlink groups all had to converge along one line of sight at the time of my observations. This map and these arrows represent a sky view observing from above the satellites. They all had to be moving in a somewhat easterly direction. If we reorient this map, that easterly direction would look like a downward direction when viewed from the ground. So this kind of makes sense. But if the UAP truly were related to Starlink, then multiple Starlink trains would have to converge roughly over the same area, over the ocean, east of Tokyo, on the same morning, during those 11 minutes, and visible between the horizon and 25 degrees altitude. I will call this the data convergence window. It includes both 3D spatial and time dimensions. Frankly, I could not get my head around this. It seemed so highly improbable. Too many coincidences, or so I thought. Well, you probably know the Heavens Above website. It has a lot of great astronomy information, including a Starlink dynamic 3D orbit display. This display shows the amazing number of Starlink satellites that blanket the planet, and the visual display provides a data-driven simulation of their current locations. If you touch any satellite with your cursor, it will identify it. After seeing the sheer numbers, I began to think maybe it was possible, so I dived deeper. If you go to this link, Starlink passes for all objects from a launch, you can actually select a 24-hour period in one specific Starlink train and look to see if it passed within sight of your location. This depends, of course, on you being logged in, having an account with Heavens Above, and your location noted. You can see here that I have displayed the Starlink G2-4 satellite train that was launched on January 19, 2023. It gives information on each satellite in the train and when it passes by your area and its location in the sky. And this is just a partial list. There are another 15 or 20 more satellites lower on this list, not shown here. But of course, I am only interested in October 16th at 3:29 to 3:40 a.m. and located to the east and below 25 degrees. Remember, the data convergence window. This is very accurate and very useful. However, I needed to check 115 spreadsheets since each launch has its own datasheet. That took some time. But before I did that data search, I wanted to be absolutely certain of the direction that I should reference. So I went back out to Kawawa-Fuji Park in the daytime and took a series of photographs with my Canon R8 camera and a compass. With a level tripod and a good magnetic compass, I could easily identify the landmarks in the photograph and the exact direction of my observations. The UAP were seen mostly between 75 and 90 degrees. That metric corresponds to east-northeast and east in casual notation. So here is my data convergence window again for closely checking the Starlink data sheets. And out of the 115 Starlink train data sheets that I looked at, to my surprise, I found that not 4 or 5, but 11 different Starlink satellite sets passed through that convergence window at the right space and time. 11 in those 11 minutes. Furthermore, from the datasheets, I could count at least 42 satellites that should have been visible at that time, all Starlink. I guess if you look at this close-up simulation with an eye to the east of Tokyo, and also keep one eye on the clock up at the top, it makes sense. There are a lot of Starlink satellites that whiz by in 11 minutes. Now, unfortunately, this simulation only moves in the forward direction. I could not reset it for October 16th to look back at my data convergence window. That would have been nice, but it was not possible. Now, let's summarize the convincing evidence. The convergence window parameters for the Starlink satellites match the UAP visual data. There was indeed at least 4 or 5 satellite trains, and the date, time, altitude, and direction all correlate as well. Also, the number of Starlink satellites predicted in the convergence window by the online data sheets was 42 satellites. I actually videotaped 30 satellites, so the numbers are fairly consistent as well. Based on all this data and all these coincidences, I am now quite convinced that my UAP or luminous objects from the previous YouTube video were indeed Starlink satellites. Almost everything fits and makes sense. Almost. But we have to make 2 assumptions. There are a couple questions which drove some of my original uncertainty, such as, why could I not see the same thing on other nights? Or every night for that matter? I went back and I looked twice at exactly the same time. When I did, I saw very few similar objects on my videotape. Like 1 or 2, not 30. I think we can explain this as a consequence of the sky clarity. Usually over Tokyo, seeing anything below 25 degrees is mostly impossible due to the light dome and usual big city haze. But on that particular morning, it was exceptionally clear. In fact, if you watch my previous video again, you will hear me mention that I thought all the stars that night looked particularly bright. It was only a few hours after a rainstorm blew through the area. It was even still a bit wet, so it probably cleaned out the haze that normally overhangs the city, enabling those observations. And the other question was, why was this phenomena visible only over Tokyo or Tokyo Bay in such a narrow observation window? Well, we can only assume that the timing was exactly the moment the first rays of sunlight started to illuminate the sky just above the eastern horizon. A coincidence, but a feasible coincidence. Well, there you have it. I think the mystery is solved. The unidentified aerial phenomena were Starlink satellites that became visible under unusually clear skies at the time that I happened to be looking. I'm now convinced, and hopefully so are you. But I will continue to keep looking and videotaping to the east at these early morning hours with my Canon R8 camera to see if I can observe and record this phenomena again in the future. Thanks for watching Astrophotography Japan. Here's wishing you clear skies and time to enjoy it. My name is Paul Cheesegel, and I am an astrophotographer.